What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. There's a bit of a triumvirate at the top of the metagame, with Scream as one corner of that triangle. This is a very powerful mid-range deck that has a bunch of different variations on it, but the baseline here is you just play a ton of incredibly good cards that also have incredibly good synergy. You are disruptive in weird ways thanks to your ability to move your opponent's cards around. Cards like Cannonball and Arrow are just very difficult for your opponent to deal with. When you have a Scream, it scales by 4. When you have a Craven and a Sam Wilson, that's also kind of scaling by 4. This is an extremely powerful deck with a very streamlined points package that got a lot of upgrades from the fact that it gets to be an Iron Patriot Sam Wilson deck. Formerly, this deck was Scream or Bust. Now it has at least 3 excellent 2-drops. Some of them are higher priority than Scream depending on the texture of your hand. And you have a much easier time on turn 4 and 5 doing 2 plus X. So on turn 4, that would be Scream plus Spider-Man, or on turn 5, Scream plus Polaris. That is a much more reasonable play now than it used to be because you have other 2-drops doing the scaling earlier. Very powerful deck, extremely strong, exactly where I would start as a baseline. Couple of other Scream variations to talk about. This one hybridizes itself with another corner of the triumvirate. That is, of course, Surtur, an extremely powerful card in its own right. We have hit the sort of apex of just jam all the good cards in a deck together and find enough overlap to make it work with a deck like this. The overlap here is that cards like Heimdall, Arrow, and Magneto are all going to trigger your Surtur, and so Surtur is just going to be a large guy. You are very interested in having large men. This is a very powerful deck just in terms of the numbers it can put on the board, and because it is able to output numbers in a way that also allows it to be disruptive with cards like Arrow and Magneto, that's what makes it a little bit harder for people to actually figure out what it's doing. It's not just raw numbers where everyone knows what the numbers are, it's numbers combined with disruption, which is the real way to play a numbers deck and get it to the top of the metagame. The Heimdall will they, won't they is one of the most dangerous in the entire game right now. Gonna spend a little less time with Scream 2099 because I am fairly convinced it is the worst version of these, but once again, we have Scream hybridizing with a powerful card in order to make the deck more powerful. Of course, that is Doom 2099 in this case. This deck is a little bit more vulnerable to typical things that are good against Doom 2099 decks. So for example, a Luke Cage deck that has US Agent. Luke Cage is going to stop the Scream. US Agent is going to shut down the Doom 2099. It's not the greatest matchup of all time. You do run into some issues with this deck more than you do with the other hybrids. I've really enjoyed this build of Control. It took me to my peak rank in SP so far this season, and it has been a genuine joy to play. Just a really powerful, unique deck that brings a lot of different powerful options to the table. I realize I've said power a lot here. Expect that in the comments, but again, that's sort of a byword, and I'm going to be really explicit about this. This deck plays 6 Season Pass cards, and the weird thing about playing 6 Season Pass cards is they're all just sort of a vanilla card with massive upside, right? We're playing multiple Season Pass 2/3s here, but all of them have enormous upside. They're not the Shocker, they're like the Shocker plus 3 other Shockers, right? We're playing multiple The Things on the Season Pass, the 4/6s, except they're not actually 4/6s, they're like 4/12s or 4/15s. And I think that that is uniquely remarkable to me that, like, this is such a repetitive thing that I'm able to say, where it's like, we are playing a lot of really good cards, and then really good is just code word for, you gotta buy these. Ajax decks are in an interesting spot, and by interesting I mean when they get a 2-drop they can actually play on 2, they're extremely dangerous, but because they only really run 2 2-drops they can play on 2 and a couple of good 3-drops, they're not actually the best at contesting opposing Iron Patriots, which means they can fall behind in mid-range matchups, i.e. against other Iron Patriot decks, because they are so much worse at dealing with what Iron Patriot can do on the opponent's side of the board. It's not the end of the world here. This is a reasonable and powerful thing to do, but you are going to be a little bit dependent on your early game in a way that doesn't necessarily feel too good. Another thing that I haven't enjoyed about being forced to be a bit of an Iron Patriot Scorpion gamer is that there's just a lot less value in my Malekith now. It's just pulling stuff that kind of sucks at the end of the game a lot of the time. It's pulling a 2-3 or the other 2-3 or a 3-3 because that's what Cassandra Nova is at the end of the game. The deck feels, on the whole, a little bit clunkier, but it still has all of the tools you need to deal with what the metagame has to offer. Luke Cage finally doesn't feel completely ridiculous. I mean, spoiler alert, when Diamondback comes out, he's gonna be completely ridiculous again, but on the whole, 3 cost in this deck is very awkward, where 2 cost in this deck is very powerful. And Luke Cage ends up falling into the 3 cost trap more than you think. The way in which this deck has developed has pointed it in the direction of being almost more of a Dakin Grandmaster deck than it is a combo, full-off combo kind of deck. And a lot of that is because it's way easier to throw priority and not be vulnerable to stuff if you're doing Dakin Grandmaster. So, for example, if you're playing Morbius, well, you get Enched, you get Rogued, you get Red Guardianed, you're playing Collector, you get Red Guardianed. When you're doing Dakin stuff, it is much harder for your opponents to meaningfully interact with what he is able to do, especially because you can put Dakin in a lane with a card that will not get moved by Grandmaster and then Grandmaster him. So Dakin has become a much more important part of this deck as people have sort of adapted to what this deck is able to output. It is still a very powerful combo deck, but you are much more Dakin oriented because of how more able you are to throw priority and avoid interaction when you are a Dakin deck. I have a lot of sympathy for this deck list. I really do enjoy it. It's a very fun twist on the Ajax formula, where everyone knows the Ajax formula is play Ajax, then play Hazmat. This is going the exact opposite way. Play Hazmat on 5, then play like Ajax, Abomination, Miles Morales. The point here is to almost play as like a Moon Girl deck. Like, that is the closest analogy for what you're trying to do here. Just vomit a bunch of points on the final turn of the game. They're not supposed to know where it's going. It's always going to be scary for your opponent because the potential range is so massive. You have the ability to move Rocket and Groot to make your Miles free. You have the ability to play an Abomination that is usually going to be free. You have a gigantic, the world's largest Ajax all of the time. If you draw well with this deck, it's extremely powerful. Notable weakness, Luke Cage. Notable weakness, Mobius M. Mobius. It happens. Speaking of Luke Cage and Mobius M. Mobius, this is a big numbers ongoing deck that looks to do exactly what it says on the tin. What I like about this deck is that it has Luke and Mobius, which means that you can have these sort of weird snaps where people might not be expecting one or the other. It's hard to get both in the deck, but I think you have to do it right now in order to give this deck, which is otherwise very predictable, some reasonable snap equity. Something like Mobius is going to be excellent into Mr. Negative, for example, and Luke Cage will 100% solo any deck that is looking to play Afflict on you. This is especially important because Affliction is very powerful against Doom 2099 based strategies, thanks to the power of US Agent. I saw so many people talking about how this deck was dead, this deck was murdered, this deck was brutally killed in an OTA. I would not be surprised if it got nerfed again. When you look at the cards that are the most important to this metagame, and therefore I think the most likely to be nerfed, you get 3 cards that they recently nerfed. I think Scream is way up there, I think Doom 2099 is way up there, and I think Surtur is way up there. This is an extremely powerful, extremely straightforward deck that if you are someone who is not overwhelmingly invested in Marvel Snap, this is going to be the best bang for your buck as long as it's around. But I honestly would not think that it's going to be around for much longer. This has been a consistent problem in Marvel Snap because of the way they do balance. When they look at things for balance, what they look at is a wide sample, like the top 50% of the entire player base. That includes a lot of people who are not tuned in, who are not playing seriously, who are just messing around. And what that means is that decks that are extremely easy, both in terms of their snap conditions and in terms of their win conditions, tend to get overrepresented and, in my opinion, maybe a little bit over-nerfed. Surtur has, every single time he's existed, been exactly this as an issue. And when we're in a metagame that is not dominated by move bounce going to 40 points all the time, Surtur is going to be a sort of you must be this tall to ride of the metagame. And right now, there are things that are tall enough, but I do think he is pushing a lot of stuff out. Good machine. Red Wing has legitimately been a good card in this list. And I realize there are going to be people who be like, Cam, I don't have Luna Snow. I'm not going to go get Luna Snow. Don't worry. You can still play the Electro version of the list. It's not the end of the world. Luna Snow just has a little more upside because she restricts you a little bit less. Don't worry about like that budget replacement. I do think it is fine. Husky Puppies played this list up to rank 3. I had my own high level of success with War Machine and this kind of setup. This is a very meta-dependent deck, though. Remember how I talked about how Surtur Skaar benefits from having a relatively lower point ceiling? This deck is the same. If the Infinite is reasonably winning a lane on his own, this is a good deck. If and when that ever changes, this deck almost immediately falls off because this is not a deck that can scale multiplicatively. This is a deck that only plays a big guy, right? And it's not even like they have multiple big guys. Not really. Like, yes, there is the Infinite and then there is another big guy, right? But like the difference between the Infinite and Magneto is like, that's a lot. Like 8 points is a whole lot. And so, like, this is a deck that has a very limited point output, even though it feels like a deck that just outputs points more than anything else. A lot of that is contextual, and there are going to be decks like, you know, if Dakin is going to 32 in multiple lanes, you start getting in real trouble. Arishem remains an excellent and functional deck, although I have had a little bit of trouble trying to figure out the exact perfect list of it. It's okay. I tried like Sam Wilson stuff with the idea that it would discount my Mockingbird a little bit, but it was too hard to get all the other cards out, so I'm back here as sort of my baseline. The Doom package is still in my deck, although I do think the Doom package is a little bit worse. I just don't think that the deck has enough of an identity without the Doom stuff that would make me actually want to cut it. I tried, I didn't like it, I ended up going back to it. The tech cards, as always, are flexible. Enchantress, Shang-Chi, and Red Guardian, I think you can mess around with. I've tried Lady Deathstrike, didn't love her. This is a deck that has room for customization, but also you're not going to actually notice the effect of your customization a lot because it's such a straightforwardly powerful deck that when you're doing good stuff, it's because you drew your cards anyway. And so whenever you're drawing the cards you actually put in your deck, you're just happier than when you're drawing the cards that you didn't. And so it's sort of hard to judge how good any card is over another card when your deck is this big. I generally prefer the Misery builds of Victoria hands to the Wiccan ones. I think the focused strategy is going to be a little bit more rewarding for people who really want to actually get as much as they can out of this archetype. And for that reason, this is what I'm having on the list instead of the Wiccan build of Misery, but there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's nice to be able to play Enchantress too. This is a powerful deck that outputs points in a meaningful way. You have a lot of different ways to get large numbers on the board. You are a very good deck at winning Iron Patriot lanes. You are a very good deck at capitalizing on doing something broken, thanks to Frigga. Copying an Iron Patriot card, copying a demon, copying a Victoria hand. All of that stuff is just very, very good. There is a lot of Enchantress running around right now, though. So you are going to be in some situations where you're going to run that risk. A lot of decks are just running an Enchantress over even a Shang-Chi some of the time. And that is bad news for a deck that is to some degree reliant on ongoings, hence the lack of Moonstone in this list. Mill is alright. This is like a pretty good deck when the metagame gets very Iron Patriot heavy. There's nothing necessarily objectively wrong with trying to play the deck like this, but it does have, you know, some good matchups and some bad matchups. If you want to beat the crap out of a Mr. Negative gamer, this is the best you're going to be able to do, even without running Mobius. Being able to just mill out their stuff and then take their cards with Cable is exceedingly powerful. This is a really strong deck into various combo decks. Not all of them, but some of them. Mr. Negative, it's pretty good into. Even Move Bounce, it's actually like weirdly functional into because Move Bounce is so finicky and awkward that like a Yondu blowing up your Human Torch is actually really bad for you. And so there are certain decks where like this is a mid-range deck with upside. It's got great matchups into other Iron Patriot decks. It's a generally strong deck, but I think a lot of Mill is sort of dependent on Killmonger and Shang-Chi. And when those cards are in the meta, when those cards are cards everyone else is playing, you're very happy about being a mill gamer, but right now the metagame is more about Luke Cage and Mobius and Enchantress than it is about Killmonger and Shang-Chi. So this deck is getting dinged a little just because it has to run Killmonger and Shang-Chi. And so the ideal meta for a deck like this is a Killmonger Shang-Chi meta that also revolves around Iron Patriot and nobody is playing Mobius. We haven't had a meta like that in like a month, and that means that Mill is a little bit less of a good fit than it was when it was very good. Mr. Negative is a very powerful deck with an offensively strong game plan that has the most points in the metagame. It is the point ceiling deck of the metagame. It's also just like a very on-off deck. Did you do your thing? Well, I hope you did, because there are very few decks in this metagame that can meaningfully interact with Mr. Negative when it's done its thing. The real worry with this deck is just getting like Legioned out of your Magic or something like that. Other than that, you're just going to farm people whenever you do the Mr. Negative Jane Foster thing, whenever you do the Magic into Mr. Negative thing, even some of the time when you do Psylocke into Mr. Negative, like that's just going to be enough. Having multiple things like Gore Mystique, Iron Man, all of that stuff getting flipped, it's extremely powerful, and you are very rarely going to find yourself in a situation where you are unable to win a game once you have several turns of Mr. Negative, or really I should say several draws from Mr. Negative. I have no idea what the 12th card in this deck is supposed to be. I know Sizer was trying Hulkbuster. I've tried Penny Parker. I tried the Hulkbuster. I didn't like it. I tried Adam Warlock. I didn't like it. He's in there currently. I don't know what the 12th card in this deck is supposed to be. If you're a move bounce aficionado, it still has a lot of the power. I understand the idea of Hulkbuster to go back to being that ceiling raising deck, to be able to reset things like Ghost Spider. I get it. But that adds just a layer of complexity that even for me is really tough. I tried Iron Patriot. Like, I'm starting to think the juice isn't worth the squeeze on this one, where it's just like, this is a very powerful deck that doesn't necessarily have it whenever you're not like just incredibly locked in. Clog is and always has been a fairly poor cube equity deck that is struggling to survive in a world where people are better at retreating than they used to be. The deck is pretty telegraphed, pretty straightforward, and unfortunately reliant on magic. It is still a viable option, which is why it's on this list, but I do think that it runs into issues with certain metagames. This is a metagame where I think it's actually pretty good, but the fundamental underlying thing of it being a deck that just has poor cube equity naturally is always going to ding it a little bit, I think. This deck, I think, is not necessarily bad right now, but it's a bit of a relic of a past time when we really needed to be a deck that had access to Cosmo and Red Guardian while also scaling upward. And I don't think the metagame calls for that at the moment. And what it does call for are things that this deck can't really provide and that other decks are better at providing. This is a deck that's almost like a hybrid control tempo deck. And I think that those kind of decks, they're always going to be it's going to be dependent on how good the control tools it has access to are in the context of the metagame. Right now, we're not in a Red Guardian Cosmo meta. We want to be in an Enchantress meta. We're a Havok deck. We just can't do that. And so there are other cards or other decks, like the control deck I talked about earlier, that are just able to occupy the role this deck is trying to occupy, but a little bit better. This is Denish's newest build of Hela, which I know because I lost to it 75 times in the last 15 hours. I hate this deck more than life itself. I hate everything that has ever happened. I remember when I guested on Magic the Gathering Commander podcast show on YouTube, right? Huge shout out to Ailey and to Olivia, who hosted me there. Ben Brode was the other guest, and I constantly made bad attacks into Ben Brode with the justification that he invented Hela, and therefore he deserved it. Everything I did was justified by that. They've since nerfed Hela. I feel the exact same way. If I ever end up in another Commander pod with Ben Brode, he's going down. That's just how it is. He has unleashed this into my life, and I don't want to deal with it anymore. I have never, ever hated a card like I hate Hela. And I on one level, I kind of appreciate that. Like it is a fun thing to have a nemesis, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I don't even know if the deck is good. I just know that I lose to it. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Please remember to like and subscribe. And if I look tired and sweaty in this episode, that's because I just got done streaming for 14 and a half hours. Thank you so much for everyone who stuck around. You've been incredible, and I will see you next time.